Fourfold Root of the Principle of Sufficient Reason, a philosophical treatise by Arthur Schopenhauer, translated by Madame Karl Hillebrand, read by Leighton Pugh for Ukemi Audiobooks. In the name of Him who instilled the fourfold in our spirit, which is the source and root of the eternal flow of creation. Pythagorean Oath. The author's preface to the second edition. This treatise on elementary philosophy, which first appeared in the year 1813, when it procured for me the degree of doctor, afterwards became the substructure for the whole of my system. It cannot therefore be allowed to remain out of print, as has been the case, without my knowledge, for the last 4 years. On the other hand, to send a juvenile work like this once more into the world with all its faults and blemishes seemed to me unjustifiable, for I am aware that the time cannot be very far off when all correction will be impossible. But with that time, the period of my real influence will commence, and this period, I trust, will be a long one, for I firmly rely upon Seneca's promise, "Although envy imposed silence on all your contemporaries, those men will come who judge without ill will and without favour." I have done what I could, therefore, to improve this work of my youth, and considering the brevity and uncertainty of life, I must even regard it as an especially fortunate circumstance to have been thus permitted to correct, in my 60th year, what I had written in my 26th. Nevertheless, while doing this, I meant to deal leniently with my younger self, and to let him discourse, nay, even speak his mind freely, wherever it was possible. But wherever he had advanced what was incorrect or superfluous, or had even left out the best part, I have been obliged to interrupt the thread of his discourse. And this has happened often enough, so often indeed that some of my readers may perhaps think they hear an old man reading a young man's book aloud, while he frequently lets it drop, in order to indulge in digressions of his own on the same subject. It is easy to see that a work thus corrected, after so long an interval, could never acquire the unity and rounded completeness which only belong to such as are written in one breath. So great a difference will be found even in style and expression, that no reader of any tact can ever be in doubt whether it be the older or younger man who is speaking. For the contrast is indeed striking between the mild, unassuming tone in which the youth, who is still simple enough to believe quite seriously that for all whose pursuit is philosophy, truth, and truth alone can have importance, and therefore that whoever promotes truth is sure of a welcome from them, propounds his arguments with confidence, and the firm, but also at times somewhat harsh voice of the old man, who in course of time has necessarily discovered the true character and real aims of the noble company of mercenary time-servers into which he has fallen. Nay, the just reader will hardly find fault with him should he occasionally give free vent to his indignation, since we see what comes of it when people who profess to have truth for their sole aim are always occupied in studying the purposes of their powerful superiors, and when the e quovis ligno fit mercurius, Mercury, the gold, can be carved from any piece of wood, is extended even to the greatest philosophers, and a clumsy charlatan like Hegel is calmly classed among them. Verily, German philosophy stands before us, loaded with contempt, the laughing-stock of other nations, expelled from all honest science, like the prostitute who sells herself for sordid hire today to one, tomorrow to another, and the brains of the present generation of savants are disorganized by Hegelian nonsense. Incapable of reflection, coarse and bewildered, they fall a prey to the low materialism which has crept out of the basilisk's egg. Good speed to them. I return to my subject. My readers will thus have to get over the difference of tone in this treatise, for I could not do here what I had done in my chief work, that is, give the later additions I had made in a separate appendix. Besides, it is of no consequence that people should know what I wrote in my 26th and what in my 60th year. The only matter of real importance is that those who wish to find their way through the fundamental principles of all philosophizing, to gain a firm footing and a clear insight, should, in these few sheets, receive a little volume by which they may learn something substantial, solid, and true. And this, I hope, will be the case. From the expansion now given to some portions, it has even grown into a compendious theory of the entire faculty of knowing, and this theory, by limiting itself strictly to the research of the principle of sufficient reason, shows the matter from a new and peculiar side. But then it finds its completion in the first book of The World as Will and Representation, together with those chapters of the second volume which refer to it, and also in my critique of Kantian philosophy. Arthur Schopenhauer, Frankfurt am Main, September 1847. On the Fourfold Root of the Principle of Sufficient Reason. Chapter 1. Introduction. Section 1. The Method. The divine Plato and the marvelous Kant unite their mighty voices in recommending a rule to serve as the method of all philosophizing as well as of all other science. Two laws, they tell us. The law of homogeneity and the law of specification should be equally observed, neither to the disadvantage of the other. The law of homogeneity directs us to collect things together into kinds by observing their resemblances and correspondences, to collect kinds again into species, species into genera, and so on, till at last we come to the highest all-comprehensive conception. Now, this law, being transcendental, i.e. essential to our reason, takes for granted that nature conforms with it, an assumption which is expressed by the ancient formula entia praeter necessitatem non esse multiplicanda. The number of entities are not to be increased unnecessarily. As for the law of specification, Kant expresses it thus: the varieties of entities are not to be diminished unnecessarily. It requires, namely, that we should clearly distinguish one from another, the different genera collected under one comprehensive conception. Likewise, that we should not confound the higher and lower species comprised in each genus, that we should be careful not to overleap any, and never to classify inferior species, let alone individuals, immediately under the generic conception, each conception being susceptible of subdivision, and none even coming down to mere intuition. Kant teaches that both laws are transcendental, fundamental principles of our reason, which postulate conformity of things with them a priori, and Plato, when he tells us that these rules were flung down from the seat of the gods with the Promethean fire, seems to express the same thought in his own way. Section 2. Application of the method in the present case. In spite of the weight of such recommendations, I find that the second of these two laws has been far too rarely applied to a fundamental principle of all knowledge, the principle of sufficient reason. For although this principle has been often and long ago stated in a general way, still sufficient distinction has not been made between its extremely different applications, in each of which it acquires a new meaning, its origin in various mental faculties thus becoming evident. If we compare Kant's philosophy with all preceding systems, we perceive that precisely in the observation of our mental faculties, many persistent errors have been caused by applying the principle of homogeneity, while the opposite principle of specification was neglected, whereas the law of specification has led to the greatest and most important results. I therefore crave permission to quote a passage from Kant, in which the application of the law of specification to the sources of our knowledge is especially recommended, for it gives countenance to my present endeavour. it is of the highest importance to isolate various sorts of knowledge, which in kind and origin are different from others, and to take great care lest they be mixed up with those others with which, for practical purposes, they are generally united. What is done by the chemist in the analysis of substances, and by the mathematician in pure mathematics, is far more incumbent on the philosopher, in order to enable him to define clearly the part which, in the promiscuous employment of the understanding, belongs to a special kind of knowledge, as well as its peculiar value and influence. Section 3. Utility of this inquiry. Should I succeed in showing that the principle which forms the subject of the present inquiry does not issue directly from one primitive notion of our intellect, but rather in the first instance from various ones, it will then follow that neither can the necessity it brings with it, as a firmly established a priori principle, be one and the same in all cases, but must, on the contrary, be as manifold as the sources of the principle itself. Whoever, therefore, bases a conclusion upon this principle incurs the obligation of clearly specifying on which of its grounds of necessity he founds his conclusion, and of designating that ground by a special name, such as I am about to suggest. I hope that this may be a step towards promoting greater lucidity and precision in philosophizing, for I hold the extreme clearness to be attained by an accurate definition of each single expression to be indispensable to us, as a defense both against error and against intentional deception, and also as a means of securing to ourselves the permanent, unalienable possession of each newly acquired notion within the sphere of philosophy, beyond the fear of losing it again on account of any misunderstanding or double meaning which might hereafter be detected. The true philosopher will indeed always seek after light and perspicuity, and will endeavour to resemble a Swiss lake, which, through its peacefulness, is enabled to unite great depth with great clearness, the depth revealing itself precisely by the clearness, rather than a turbid, impetuous mountain torrent. La clarté est la bonne foi des philosophes. Clarity is the good faith of philosophers, says Vauvant-Arc. Pseudo-philosophers, on the contrary, use speech, not indeed to conceal their thoughts, as Monsieur de Talleyrand has it, but rather to conceal the absence of them, and are apt to make their readers responsible for the incomprehensibility of their systems, which really proceeds from their own confused thinking. This explains why in certain writers, Schelling, for instance, the tone of instruction so often passes into that of reproach, and frequently the reader is even taken to task beforehand for his assumed inability to understand. Section 4. Importance of the principle of sufficient reason. Its importance is indeed very great, since it may truly be called the basis of all science, for by science we understand a system of notions, i.e., a totality of connected as opposed to a mere aggregate of disconnected notions. But what is it that binds together the members of a system, if not the principle of sufficient reason? That which distinguishes every science from a mere aggregate is precisely that its notions are derived one from another as from their reason. So it was long ago observed by Plato, for even true opinions are not of much value until someone binds them through reasoning. Nearly every science, moreover, contains notions of causes from which the effects may be deduced, and likewise other notions of the necessity of conclusions from reasons, as will be seen during the course of this inquiry. Aristotle has expressed this as follows: all knowledge which is of a theoretical nature, or is any way concerned with the theoretical, is concerned with grounds and principles. Now, as it is this very assumption a priori that all things must have their reason, which authorizes us everywhere to search for the why, we may safely call this why the mother of all science. Section 5. The principle itself. We purpose showing further on that the principle of sufficient reason is an expression common to several a priori notions. Meanwhile, it must be stated under some formula or other. I choose Wolff's as being the most comprehensive. Nihil est sine ratione cor potius sit, quam non sit. Nothing is without a ground or a reason why it is, rather than is not. Chapter 2. General survey of the most important views hitherto held concerning the principle of sufficient reason. Section 6. First statement of the principle and distinction between two of its meanings. A more or less accurately defined abstract expression for so fundamental a principle of all knowledge must have been found at a very early age. It would, therefore, be difficult, and besides of no great interest, to determine where it first appeared. Neither Plato nor Aristotle have formally stated it as a leading fundamental principle, although both often speak of it as a self-evident truth. Thus, with a naivety which savours of the state of innocence, as opposed to that of the knowledge of good and of evil, when compared with the critical researches of our own times, Plato says, "It is necessary for everything that happens to happen through a cause, for how could it happen without this?" And then again, "All that happens must necessarily happen by virtue of a cause, for it is impossible for anything to come into existence without cause." At the end of his book De Fato, Plutarch cites the following among the chief propositions of the Stoics. The most important and fundamental principle should be that nothing ensues without cause, but everything occurs according to preceding causes. In the Posterior Analytics, Book 1, Chapter 2, Aristotle states the principle of sufficient reason to a certain degree when he says, "We think we understand everything perfectly when we think we know the cause by which the thing exists, namely, that it is the cause of that thing, and that this could not possibly be otherwise." In his Metaphysics, moreover, he already divides causes, or rather principles, into different kinds, of which he admits 8. But this division is neither profound nor precise enough. He is, nevertheless, quite right in saying, "All principles have in common the fact that they are the first thing through which anything exists, occurs, or is known." In the following chapter he distinguishes several kinds of causes, although somewhat superficially and confusedly. In the Posterior Analytics, Book 2, Chapter 11, he states 4 kinds of causes in a more satisfactory manner. There are 4 kinds of causes. The first consists in what constitutes the essence of the thing, the second in what must be assumed as substratum if a thing exists, the third in what first put a thing in motion, the fourth in the purpose for which it is. Now this is the origin of the division of the causae universally adopted by the scholastic philosophers into causae materiales, formales, efficientes et finales, as may be seen in Suarez's Metaphysical Disputations, a real compendium of scholasticism. Even Hobbes still quotes and explains this division. It is also to be found in another passage of Aristotle, this time somewhat more clearly and fully developed, Metaphysics, and it is again briefly noticed in Aristotle's On Sleep and Sleeplessness. As for the vitally important distinction between reason and cause, however, Aristotle no doubt betrays something like a conception of it in the Posterior Analytics, where he shows at considerable length that knowing and proving that a thing exists is a very different thing from knowing and proving why it exists. What he represents as the latter being knowledge of the cause, as the former knowledge of the reason. If, however, he had quite clearly recognized the difference between them, he would never have lost sight of it, but would have adhered to it throughout his writings. Now, this is not the case. For even when he endeavours to distinguish the various kinds of causes from one another, as in the passages I have mentioned above, the essential difference mooted in the chapter just alluded to never seems to occur to him again. Besides, he uses the term aitios, cause, reason, blame, indiscriminately for every kind of cause, often indeed calling reasons of knowledge, and sometimes even the premises of a conclusion, as for instance in his Metaphysics, Rhetoric, De Plantis, but more especially Posterior Analytics, where he calls the premises to a conclusion simply causes of the conclusion. Now, using the same word to express two closely connected conceptions is a sure sign that their difference has not been recognized, or at any rate, not been firmly grasped. For a mere accidental, homonymous designation of two widely differing things is quite another matter. Nowhere, however, does this error appear more conspicuously than in his definition of the sophism, reasoning from what is not cause as if it were cause, in the book Sophistical Refutations. By aitios, he here understands absolutely nothing but the argument, the premises, consequently a reason of knowledge. For this sophism consists in correctly proving the impossibility of something, while the proof has no bearing whatever upon the proposition in dispute, which it is nevertheless supposed to refute. Here, therefore, there is no question at all of physical causes. Still, the use of the word aitios has had so much weight with modern logicians that they hold to it exclusively in their accounts of the fallacia extra dictionem, fallacies attributable not only to words, and explain the fallacia non causae ut causa, fallacy based on a cause that is not a cause, as designating a physical cause, which is not the case. Reimarus, for instance, does so, and G.E. Schulze and Fries, all indeed of whom I have any knowledge. The first work in which I find a correct definition of this sophism is Tvestens Logic. Moreover, in all other scientific works and controversies, the charge of a fallacy based on a cause that is not a cause usually denotes the interpolation of a wrong cause. Sextus Empiricus presents another forcible instance of the way in which the ancients were wont universally to confound the logical law of the reason of knowledge with the transcendental law of cause and effect in nature, persistently mistaking one for the other. In the 9th book, Adversus Mathematicos, that is, the book Adversus Physicos, section 204, he undertakes to prove the law of causality and says, "He who asserts that there is no cause, aetia, either has no cause, aetia, for his assertion, or has one. In the former case there is not more truth in his assertion than in its contradiction. In the latter, his assertion itself proves the existence of a cause." By this we see that the ancients had not yet arrived at a clear distinction between requiring a reason as the ground of a conclusion and asking for a cause for the occurrence of a real event. As for the scholastic philosophers of later times, the law of causality was, in their eyes, an axiom above investigation. We do not inquire if there is a cause, since nothing is more certain in and of itself, says Suarez. At the same time they held fast to the above-quoted Aristotelian classification, but as far as I know at least, they equally failed to arrive at a clear idea of the necessary distinction of which we are here speaking. Section 7. Descartes. For we find even the excellent Descartes, who gave the first impulse to subjective reflection, and thereby became the father of modern philosophy, still entangled in confusions for which it is difficult to account, and we shall soon see to what serious and deplorable consequences these confusions have led with regard to metaphysics. In the Meditations on First Philosophy, Axiom 1, he says, "Nothing exists of which it could not be asked from which cause it exists. This can even be asked concerning God, not as if he requires some sort of cause in order to exist, but because the immensity of his nature is the cause or the reason, because of which he requires no cause in order to exist. He ought to have said, the immensity of God is a logical reason from which it follows that God needs no cause, whereas he confounds the two together, and obviously has no clear consciousness of the difference between reason and cause. Properly speaking, however, it is his intention which mars his insight, for here, where the law of causality demands a cause, he substitutes a reason instead of it, because the latter, unlike the former, does not immediately lead to something beyond it, and thus, by means of this very axiom, he clears the way to the ontological proof of the existence of God, which was really his invention, for Anselm had only indicated it in a general manner. Immediately after these axioms, of which I have just quoted the first, there comes a formal, quite serious statement of the ontological proof, which, in fact, already lies within that axiom, as the chicken does within the egg that has been long brooded over. Thus, while everything else stands in need of a cause for its existence, the immensitas implied in the conception of the deity, who is introduced to us upon the ladder of the cosmological proof, suffices in lieu of a cause, or as the proof itself expresses it, in the concept of the supremely perfect being, his existence is necessarily contained. This, then, is the sleight of hand trick, for the sake of which the confusion, familiar even to Aristotle, of the two principal meanings of the principle of sufficient reason, has been used directly in Maiorem Dei Gloriam, to the greater glory of God. Considered by daylight, however, and without prejudice, this famous ontological proof is really a charming joke. On some occasion or other, someone excogitates a conception composed out of all sorts of predicates, among which, however, he takes care to include the predicate actuality or existence, either openly stated or wrapped up for decency's sake in some other predicate, such as perfectio, immensitas, or something of the kind. Now, it is well known that from a given conception, those predicates which are essential to it, i.e., without which it cannot be thought, and likewise the predicates which are essential to those predicates themselves, may be extracted by means of purely logical analyses, and consequently have logical truth, that is, they have their reason of knowledge in the given conception. Accordingly, the predicate reality or existence is now extracted from this arbitrarily thought conception, and an object corresponding to it is forthwith presumed to have real existence independently of the conception. Were not the thought so cursedly acute, one might be tempted to declare it silly. Schiller. After all, the simplest answer to such ontological demonstrations is, all depends upon the source whence you have derived your conception. If it be taken from experience, all well and good, for in this case its object exists and needs no further proof. If, on the contrary, it has been hatched in your own half-head, all its predicates are of no avail, for it is a mere phantasm. But we form an unfavourable prejudice against the pretensions of a theology which needed to have recourse to such proofs as this in order to gain a footing on the territory of philosophy, to which it is quite foreign, but on which it longs to trespass. But oh, for the prophetic wisdom of Aristotle! He had never even heard of the ontological proof, yet as though he could detect this piece of scholastic jugglery through the shades of coming darkness, and were anxious to bar the road to it, he carefully shows that defining a thing and proving its existence are two different matters, separate to all eternity, since by the one we learn what it is that is meant, and by the other that such a thing exists. Like an oracle of the future, he pronounces the sentence, "Since being is not a genus, it is not the essence of anything," which means, to be never can belong to the essence of a thing. On the other hand, we may see how great was Herr von Schelling's veneration for the ontological proof in a long note of the first volume of his Philosophical Writings of 1809. We may even see in it something still more instructive, i.e., how easily Germans allow sand to be thrown in their eyes by impudence and blustering swagger. But for so thoroughly pitiable a creature as Hegel, whose whole pseudo-philosophy is but a monstrous amplification of the ontological proof, to have undertaken its defence against Kant is indeed an alliance of which the ontological proof itself might be ashamed, however little it may in general be given to blushing. How can I be expected to speak with deference of men who have brought philosophy into contempt? Section 8. Spinoza. Although Spinoza's philosophy mainly consists in the negation of the double dualism between God and the world and between soul and body, which his teacher, Descartes, had set up, he nevertheless remained true to his master in confounding and interchanging the relationship between reason and consequence with that between cause and effect. He even endeavoured to draw from it a still greater advantage for his own metaphysics than Descartes for his, for he made this confusion the foundation of his whole pantheism. A conception contains implicite all its essential predicates, so that they may be developed out of it explicite by means of mere analytical judgments, the sum total of them being its definition. This definition therefore differs from the conception itself merely in form and not in content, for it consists of judgments which are all contained within that conception, and therefore have their reason in it, in as far as they show its essence. We may accordingly look upon these judgments as the consequences of that conception, considered as their reason. Now, this relation between a conception and the judgments founded upon it and susceptible of being developed out of it by analysis is precisely the relation between Spinoza's so-called God and the world, or rather between the one and only substance and its numberless accidents. God, or the substance consisting of an infinite number of attributes. Ethics, Book 1. God, or all the attributes of God. It is therefore the relation between the ground of knowledge and its consequence. Whereas true theism, Spinoza's theism is merely nominal, assumes the relation of the cause to its effect, in which the cause remains different and separate from the consequence, not only in the way in which we consider them, but really and essentially, therefore in themselves to all eternity. For the word God, honestly used, means a cause such as this of the world, with the addition of personality. An impersonal God is, on the contrary, a contradiction in terms. Now, as nevertheless, even in the case as stated by him, Spinoza desired to retain the word God to express substance, and explicitly called this the cause of the world, he could find no other way to do it than by completely intermingling the two relations, and confounding the principle of the reason of knowledge with the principle of causality. I call attention to the following passages from Spinoza's Ethics in corroboration of this statement. It is to be noted that for each thing that exists, there is necessarily a definite cause with reference to which it exists, and it is to be noted that this cause, because that thing exists, must either be comprehended in the existing thing's own nature and definition, since it specifically belongs to the nature itself of the thing to exist, or that it must be given as something outside of itself. In the last case, he means an efficient cause, as appears from what follows, whereas in the first he means a mere reason of knowledge. Yet he identifies both, and by this means prepares the way for identifying God with the world, which is his intention. This is the artifice of which he always makes use, and which he has learnt from Descartes. He substitutes a cause acting from without for a reason of knowledge lying within, a given conception. From the necessity of the divine nature, everything that can fall under infinite intellect must follow. At the same time, he calls God everywhere the cause of the world. Everything that exists expresses the power of God, who is the cause of all things. God is the immanent cause of all things, but not the transient. God is the efficient cause, not only of things existing, but also of the essence of things. It says in Ethics, Book 3, Proposition 1, proof, from any given idea, some effect must necessarily follow, and further, nothing can be destroyed unless it be from an external cause. Proof, the definition of anything affirms its essence. Essence, nature as distinct from existentia, existence, and does not negate it. In other words, it maintains the essence of the thing and does not deny it. If, therefore, we attend to the thing itself and not to external causes, we can see nothing in it that would be able to destroy it. This means that as no conception can contain anything which contradicts its definition, i.e. the sum total of its predicates, neither can an existence contain anything which might become a cause of its destruction. This view, however, is brought to a climax in the somewhat lengthy second demonstration of the 11th proposition, in which he confounds a cause capable of destroying or annihilating a being with a contradiction contained in its definition, and therefore destroying that definition. His need of confounding cause with reason here becomes so urgent that he can never say cause or reason alone, but always finds it necessary to put reason or cause. Accordingly, this occurs as many as 8 times in the same page, in order to conceal the subterfuge. Descartes had done the same in the above-mentioned axiom. Thus, properly speaking, Spinoza's pantheism is merely the realization of Descartes' ontological proof. First, he adopts Descartes' ontotheological proposition, to which we have alluded above. The immensity of God's nature is the cause or the reason, because of which he requires no cause in order to exist, in the beginning, and then he finishes by the essence of substance necessarily involves existence, or existence belongs to its nature. Therefore, substance must be the cause of itself. Therefore, the very same argument which Descartes had used to prove the existence of God is used by Spinoza to prove the existence of the world, which consequently needs no God. He does this still more distinctly in the second scholium to the 8th proposition. Since existence appertains to the nature of substance, its definition must necessarily involve existence, and consequently, from its definition alone, existence must be inferred. But this substance is, as we know, the world. The demonstration to Proposition 24 says in the same sense, for that which of its nature, considered in itself alone, i.e. the definition, involves existence, is the causa sui. For what Descartes had stated in an exclusively ideal and subjective sense, i.e. only for us, for cognitive purposes, in this instance for the sake of proving the existence of God, Spinoza took in a real and objective sense, as the actual relation of God to the world. According to Descartes, the existence of God is contained in the conception of God. Therefore, it becomes an argument for his actual being. According to Spinoza, God is himself contained in the world. Thus, what with Descartes was only reason of knowledge becomes with Spinoza reason of fact. If the former, in his ontological proof, taught that the existence of God is a consequence of the essence of God, the latter turns this into causa sui, and boldly opens his ethics with, by that which is causa sui, I mean that of which the essence, concept, involves existence, remaining deaf to Aristotle's warning cry, existence does not belong to the essence of anything. Now, this is the most palpable confusion of reason and cause, and if neo-Spinozans, Schellingites, Hegelians, etc., with whom words are wont to pass for thoughts, often indulge in pompous, solemn admiration for this causa sui, for my own part, I see nothing but a contradiction in terms in this same causa sui, a before, that is after, an audacious command to us to sever arbitrarily the eternal causal chain. Something, in short, very like the proceeding of that Austrian, who, finding himself unable to reach high enough to fasten the clasp on his tightly strapped shako, got upon a chair. The right emblem for causa sui is Baron Münchhausen, sinking on horseback into the water, clinging by the legs to his horse, and pulling both himself and the animal out by his own pigtail, with the motto underneath, causa sui, cause of itself. Let us finally cast a look at the 16th proposition of the first book of the Ethics. Here we find Spinoza concluding from the proposition, from the given definition of anything, the intellect concludes further properties which in fact necessarily follow from this definition. Is inferred, from the necessity of the divine nature, i.e. taken to be real, infinite things must follow in infinite ways. This God, therefore, unquestionably stands in the same relation to the world as a conception to its definition. The corollary, God is the efficient cause of all things, is nevertheless immediately connected with it. It is impossible to carry the confusion between reason and cause farther, nor could it lead to graver consequences than here. But this shows the importance of the subject of the present treatise. In endeavouring to add a third step to the climax in question, Herr von Schelling has contributed a small afterpiece to these errors, into which two mighty intellects of the past had fallen owing to insufficient clearness in thinking. If Descartes met the demands of the inexorable law of causality, which reduced his God to the last straits, by substituting a reason instead of the cause required, in order thus to set the matter at rest, and if Spinoza made a real cause out of this reason, i.e. causa sui, his God thereby becoming the world itself, Schelling now made reason and consequent separate in God himself. He thus gave the thing still greater consistency by elevating it to a real, substantial hypostasis of reason and consequent, and introducing us to something in God which is not himself, but his reason as a primary reason, or rather reason beyond reason, abyss. This is truly precious. It is now known that Schelling had taken the whole fable from Jacob Boehmer's full account of the terrestrial and celestial mystery, but what appears to me to be less well known is the source from which Jacob Boehmer himself had taken it, and the real birthplace of this so-called abyss, wherefore I now take the liberty to mention it. It is the bottomless pit, reason beyond reason, of the Valentinians, a heretical sect of the 2nd century, which, in silence, coessential with itself, engendered intelligence and the world, as Irenaeus relates in the following terms. For they say that in those unseen heights which have no name, there is a pre-existing perfect aeon. This they also call Fore-rule, Forefather, and the abyss. They say that being incomprehensible and invisible, eternal and unborn, he has existed during endless eons in the deepest calmness and tranquillity, and that coexisting with him was understanding, which they also called grace and silence. This abyss, thought to put forth from himself the beginning of all things, and to lay that offshoot, which he had resolved to put forth, like a seed into the coexisting silence, as it were into a womb. Now this silence, being thus impregnated, and having conceived, gave birth to understanding, a being which was like and equal to its Creator, and alone able to comprehend the greatness of its Father. This understanding they also called the only begotten and beginning of everything. Somehow or other this must have come to Jacob Boehmer's hearing from the history of heresy, and Herr von Schelling must have received it from him in all faith. Section 9. Leibniz. It was Leibniz who first formally stated the principle of sufficient reason as a main principle of all knowledge and of all science. He proclaims it very pompously in various passages of his works, giving himself great airs, as though he had been the first to invent it. Yet all he finds to say about it is that everything must have a sufficient reason for being as it is, and not otherwise. And this the world had probably found out before him. True, he makes casual allusions to the distinction between its two chief significations, without, however, laying any particular stress upon it, or explaining it clearly anywhere else. The principal reference to it is in his Principia Philosophiae, and a little more satisfactorily in the French version entitled Monadologie. By virtue of the principle of sufficient reason, we assume that no fact can be true or real, and no judgment correct, without there being a sufficient reason or ground why it is thus, and not otherwise. Section 10. Christian Wolff. The first writer who explicitly separated the two chief significations of our principle and stated the difference between them in detail was therefore Wolff. Wolff, however, does not place the principle of sufficient reason in logic, as is now the custom, but in ontology. True, in section 71 he urges the necessity of not confounding the principle of sufficient reason of knowing with that of cause and effect. Still, he does not clearly determine here wherein the difference consists. Indeed, he himself mistakes the one for the other, for he quotes instances of cause and effect in confirmation of the Principium Rationis Sufficientis in this very chapter, De Ratione Sufficiente, sections 70, 74, 75, and 77, which, had he really wished to preserve that distinction, ought rather to have been quoted in the chapter De Causis of the same work. In said chapter he again brings forward precisely similar instances, and once more enunciates the Principium Cognoscendi, section 876, which does not certainly belong to it, having been already discussed, yet which serves to introduce the immediately following clear and definite distinction between this principle and the law of causality, sections 881 to 884. Principium, he continues, that is called principle which contains within itself the ground or reason for something else, and he distinguishes three kinds. 1. Principium fiendi, causa, which he defines as the principle of reason of becoming, the reason for the actuality of another thing, e.g., if the stone becomes hot, fire or the sun's rays are the reasons why heat is inherent in the stone. 2. Principium essendi, which he defines as the principle of reason of being, the reason for the possibility of another thing. In the same example, the reason for the stone's capacity to absorb heat is to be found in the essential nature of the stone, that is, in the manner of its composition. This last conception seems to me inadmissible. If it has any meaning at all, possibility means correspondence with the general conditions of experience known to us a priori, as Kant has sufficiently shown. From these conditions we know, with respect to Wolff's instance of the stone, that changes are possible as effects proceeding from causes. We know, that is, that one state can succeed another, if the former contains the conditions for the latter. In this case we find, as effect, the state of being warm in the stone, as cause, the preceding state of a limited capacity for warmth in the stone and its contact with free heat. Now Wolff's naming the first mentioned property of this state, Principium essendi, and the second Principium fiendi, rests upon a delusion caused by the fact that, so far as the stone is concerned, the conditions are more lasting and can therefore wait longer for the others. That the stone should be as it is, that it should be chemically so constituted as to bring with it a particular degree of specific heat, consequently a capacity for heat which stands in inverse proportion to its specific heat, that besides it should, on the other hand, come into contact with free heat, is the consequence of a whole chain of antecedent causes, all of them principia fiendi. but it is the coincidence of circumstances on both sides which primarily constitutes that condition upon which, as cause, the becoming warm depends, as effect. All this leaves no room for Wolff's principium essendi, which I therefore do not admit, and concerning which I have here entered somewhat into detail, partly because I mean to use the word myself later on in a totally different sense, partly also because this explanation contributes to facilitate the comprehension of the law of causality. 3. Wolff, as we have said, distinguishes a principium cognoscendi and refers also under causa to an impulsive cause or reason determining the will. Section 11. Philosophers between Wolff and Kant. Baumgarten repeats the Wolffian distinctions in his Metaphysica, sections 20 to 24, and sections 306 to 313. Reimarus, in his Vernunftlehre, section 81, distinguishes 1. Inward reason, of which his explanation agrees with Wolff's ratio essendi, and might even be applicable to the ratio cognoscendi if he did not transfer to things what only applies to conceptions. 2. Outward reason, i.e., causa, section 120, he rightly defines the ratio cognoscendi as a condition of the proposition, but in an example, section 125, he nevertheless confounds it with cause. Lambert, in the New Organon, does not mention Wolff's distinctions. He shows, however, that he recognizes a difference between reason of knowledge and cause, for he says that God is the principium essendi of truths, and that truths are the principia cognoscendi of God. Platner, in his Aphorisms, section 868, says, "What is called reason and conclusion within our knowledge, principium cognoscendi, ratio rationatum, is in reality cause and effect, causa efficiens, effectus. Every cause is a reason, every effect a conclusion." He is therefore of opinion that cause and effect in reality correspond to the conceptions reason and consequence in our thought, that the former stand in a similar relation with respect to the latter as substance and accident, for instance to subject and predicate, or the quality of the object to our sensation of that quality, etc., etc. I think it useless to refute this opinion, for it is easy to see that premises and conclusion in judgments stand in an entirely different relation to one another from a knowledge of cause and effect, although in individual cases even knowledge of a cause as such may be the reason of a judgment which enunciates the effect. Section 12. Hume. No one before this serious thinker had ever doubted what follows. First, and before all things in heaven and on earth, is the principle of sufficient reason in the form of the law of causality. For it is a veritas aeterna, eternal truth, i.e., it is in and by itself above gods and fate, whereas everything else, the understanding, for instance, which thinks that principle, and no less the whole world, and whatever may be its cause, atoms, motion, a creator, etc., is what it is only in accordance with and by virtue of that principle. Hume was the first to whom it occurred to inquire whence this law of causality derives its authority, and to demand its credentials. Everyone knows the result at which he arrives, that causality is nothing beyond the empirically perceived succession of things and states in time, with which habit has made us familiar. The fallacy of this result is felt at once, nor is it difficult to refute. The merit lies in the question itself, for it became the impulse and starting point for Kant's profound researches, and by their means led to an incomparably deeper and more thorough view of idealism than the one which had hitherto existed, and which was chiefly Berkeley's. It led to transcendental idealism, from which arises the conviction that the world is as dependent upon us as a whole as we are dependent upon it in detail, For by pointing out the existence of those transcendental principles as such, which enable us to determine a priori, i.e. before all experience, certain points concerning objects and their possibility, he proved that these things could not exist, as they present themselves to us, independently of our knowledge. The resemblance between a world such as this and a dream is obvious. Section 13. Kant and his school. Kant's chief passage on the principle of sufficient reason is in a little work entitled On a Discovery which is to permit us to dispense with all criticism of pure reason, Section 1. Here he strongly urges the distinction between the logical, formal principle of cognition, every proposition must have its reason, and the transcendental, material principle, everything must have its cause, in his controversy with Eberhard, who had identified them as one and the same. I intend myself to criticize Kant's proof of the a priori and consequently transcendental character of the law of causality further on, in a separate paragraph, after having given the only true proof. With these precedents to guide them, the several writers on logic belonging to Kant's school, Hofbauer, Maas, Jakob, Kiesewetter, and others, have defined pretty accurately the distinction between reason and cause. Kiesewetter, more especially, gives it thus quite satisfactorily: reason of knowledge is not to be confounded with reason of fact, cause. The principle of sufficient reason belongs to logic, that of causality to metaphysics. The former is the fundamental principle of thought, the latter that of experience. Cause refers to real things. Logical reason has only to do with representations. Kant's adversaries urge this distinction still more strongly. G. E. Schulze complains that the principle of sufficient reason is confounded with that of causality. Salomon Maimon regrets that so much should be said about the sufficient reason without an explanation of what is meant by it, while he blames Kant for deriving the principle of causality from the logical form of hypothetical judgments. F. H. Jacobi says that by the confounding of the two conceptions, reason and cause, an illusion is produced which has given rise to various false speculations. And he points out the distinction between them after his own fashion. Here, however, as is usual with him, we find a good deal more of self-complacent phrase-jugglery than of serious philosophy. How Herr von Schelling finally distinguishes reason from cause may be seen in his Aphorisms Introductory to the Philosophy of Nature, section 184, which open the first book of the first volume of Marcus and Schelling's Annals of Medicine. Here we are taught that gravity is the reason and light the cause of all things. This I merely quote as a curiosity, for such random talk would not otherwise deserve a place among the opinions of serious and honest inquirers. Section 14. On the Proofs of the Principle. We have still to record various fruitless attempts which have been made to prove the principle of sufficient reason, mostly without clearly defining in which sense it was taken. Wolff's, for instance, in his Ontology, section 70, repeated by Baumgarten in his Metaphysics, section 20. It is useless to repeat and refute it here, as it obviously rests on a verbal quibble. Platner and Jakob have tried other proofs, in which, however, the circle is easily detected. I purpose dealing with those of Kant further on, as I've already said, since I hope in the course of this treatise to point out the different laws of our cognitive faculties, of which the principle of sufficient reason is the common expression. It will result as a matter of course that this principle cannot be proved, and that, on the contrary, Aristotle's remark, "They seek a reason for that which has no reason, for the principle of demonstration is not demonstration," may be applied with equal propriety to all these proofs. For every proof is a reference to something already recognized, and if we continue requiring a proof, again, for this something, whatever it be, we at last arrive at certain propositions which express the forms and laws, therefore the conditions, of all thought and of all knowledge, in the application of which, consequently, all thought and all knowledge consists, so that certainty is nothing but correspondence with those conditions, forms, and laws. Therefore their own certainty cannot again be ascertained by means of other propositions. In the 5th chapter, I mean to discuss the kind of truth which belongs to propositions such as these. To seek a proof for the principle of sufficient reason is, moreover, an especially flagrant absurdity, which shows a want of reflection. Every proof is a demonstration of the reason for a judgment which has been pronounced, and which receives the predicate true in virtue precisely of that demonstration. This necessity for a reason is exactly what the principle of sufficient reason expresses. Now, if we require a proof of it, or, in other words, a demonstration of its reason, we thereby already assume it to be true. Nay, we found our demand precisely upon that assumption, and thus we find ourselves involved in the circle of exacting a proof of our right to exact a proof. Chapter 3. Insufficiency of the old and outlines of a new demonstration. Section 15. Cases which are not comprised among the old established meanings of the principle. From the summary given in the preceding chapter, we gather that two distinct applications of the principle of sufficient reason have been recognized, although very gradually, very tardily, and not without frequent relapses into error and confusion, the one being its application to judgments, which, to be true, must have a reason, the other its application to changes in material objects, which must always have a cause. In both cases we find the principle of sufficient reason authorizing us to ask why, a quality which is essential to it. But are all the cases in which it authorizes us to ask why comprised in these two relations? If I ask, why are the three sides of this triangle equal, the answer is, because the three angles are so. Now, is the equality of the angles the cause of the equality of the sides? No, for here we have to do with no change, consequently with no effect which must have a cause. Is it merely a logical reason? No. For the equality of the angle is not only a proof of the equality of the sides, it is not only the foundation of a judgment. Mere conceptions alone would never suffice to explain why the sides must be equal, because the angles are so. For the conception of the equality of the sides is not contained in that of the equality of the angles. Here, therefore, we have no connection between conceptions and judgments, but between sides and angles. The equality of the angles is not the direct, but the indirect reason by which we know the equality of the sides. For it is the reason why a thing is such as it is, in this case, that the sides are equal. The angles being equal, the sides must therefore be equal. Here we have a necessary connection between angles and sides, not a direct necessary connection between two judgments. Or again, if I ask why infecta facta, but never facta infecta fieri possunt, what is undone can be done, but what is done can never be undone. Consequently, why the past is absolutely irrevocable, the future inevitable. Even this does not admit of purely logical proof by means of mere abstract conceptions, nor does it belong either to causality, which only rules occurrences within time, not time itself. The present hour hurled the preceding one into the bottomless pit of the past, not through causality, but immediately through its mere existence, which existence was nevertheless inevitable. It is impossible to make this comprehensible or even clearer by means of mere conceptions. We recognize it, on the contrary, quite directly and instinctively, just as we recognize the difference between right and left, and all that depends upon it. For instance, that our left glove will not fit our right hand, etc., etc. Now, as all those cases in which the principle of sufficient reason finds its application cannot therefore be reduced to logical reason and consequence, and to cause and effect, the law of specification cannot have been sufficiently attended to in this classification. The law of homogeneity, however, obliges us to assume that these cases cannot differ to infinity, but that they may be reduced to certain species. Now, before attempting this classification, it will be necessary to determine what is peculiar to the principle of sufficient reason in all cases, as its special characteristic, because the conception of the genus must always be determined before the conception of the species. Section 16. The roots of the principle of sufficient reason. Our knowing consciousness, which manifests itself as outer and inner sensibility, or receptivity, and as understanding and reason, subdivides itself into subject and object, and contains nothing else. To be object for the subject, and to be our representation are the same thing. All our representations stand towards one another in a regulated connection, which may be determined a priori, and on account of which nothing existing separately and independently, nothing single or detached, can become an object for us. It is this connection which is expressed by the principle of sufficient reason in its generality. Now, although, as may be gathered from what has gone before, this connection assumes different forms according to the different kinds of objects, which forms are differently expressed by the principle of sufficient reason, still the connection retains what is common to all these forms, and this is expressed in a general and abstract way by our principle. The relations upon which it is founded, and which will be more closely indicated in this treatise, are what I call the root of the principle of sufficient reason. Now, on closer inspection, according to the laws of homogeneity and of specification, these relations separate into distinct species, which differ widely from each other. Their number, however, may be reduced to 4, according to the 4 classes into which everything that can become an object for us, that is to say, all our representations, may be divided. These classes will be stated and considered in the following 4 chapters. We shall see the principle of sufficient reason appear under a different form in each of them, but it will also show itself under all as the same principle, and as derived from the said root, precisely because it admits of being expressed as above. Chapter 4. On the first class of objects for the subject, and that form of the principle of sufficient reason which predominates in it. Section 17. General account of this class of objects. The first class of objects possible to our representative faculty is that of intuitive, complete empirical representations. They are intuitive as opposed to mere thoughts, i.e. abstract conceptions. They are complete, inasmuch as, according to Kant's distinction, they not only contain the formal, but also the material part of phenomena, and they are empirical, partly as proceeding not from a mere connection of thoughts, but from an excitation of feeling in our sensitive organism, as their origin, to which they constantly refer for evidence as to their reality, partly also because they are linked together according to the united laws of space, time, and causality, in that complex without beginning or end which forms our empirical reality. As nevertheless, according to the result of Kant's teaching, this empirical reality does not annul their transcendental ideality, we shall consider them here, where we have only to do with the formal elements of knowledge, merely as representations. Section 18. Outline of a transcendental analysis of empirical reality. The forms of these representations are those of the inner and outer sense, namely time and space, but these are only perceptible when filled. Their perceptibility is matter, to which I shall return further on, and again in section 21. If time were the only form of these representations, there could be no coexistence, therefore nothing permanent and no duration. for time is only perceived when filled, and its course is only perceived by the changes which take place in that which fills it. The permanence of an object is therefore only recognized by contrast with the changes going on in other objects coexistent with it. But the representation of coexistence is impossible in time alone. It depends, for its completion, upon the representation of space, because in mere time all things follow one another, and in mere space all things are side by side. It is accordingly only by the combination of time and space that the representation of coexistence arises. On the other hand, were space the sole form of this class of representations, there would be no change, for change or alteration is succession of states, and succession is only possible in time. We may therefore define time as the possibility of opposite states in one and the same thing. Thus we see that although infinite divisibility and infinite extension are common to both time and space, these two forms of empirical representations differ fundamentally, inasmuch as what is essential to the one is without any meaning at all for the other. Juxtaposition having no meaning in time, succession no meaning in space. The empirical representations which belong to the orderly complex of reality appear notwithstanding in both forms together. Nay, the intimate union of both is the condition of reality which, in a sense, grows out of them, as a product grows out of its factors. Now it is the understanding which, by means of its own peculiar function, brings about this union, and connects these heterogeneous forms in such a manner that empirical reality, albeit only for that understanding, arises out of their mutual interpenetration, and arises as a collective representation forming a complex held together by the forms of the principle of sufficient reason, but whose limits are problematical. Each single representation belonging to this class is a part of this complex, each one taking its place in it according to laws known to us a priori. In it, therefore, countless objects coexist, because substance, i.e. matter, remains permanent in spite of the ceaseless flow of time, and because its states change in spite of the rigid immobility of space. In this complex, in short, the whole objective real world exists for us. The reader who may be interested in this will find the present rough sketch of the analysis of empirical reality further worked out in section 4 of the first volume of Die Welt als Wille und Vorstellung, where a closer explanation is given of the way in which the understanding affects this union and thus creates for itself the empirical world. He will also find a very important help in the table Predicabilia a priori of time, space, and matter, which is added to the 4th chapter of the 2nd volume of the same work, and which I recommend to his attention, as it especially shows how the contrasts of time and space are equally balanced in matter, as their product, under the form of causality. We shall now proceed to give a detailed exposition of that function of the understanding which is the basis of empirical reality. Only we must first, by a few incidental explanations, remove the more immediate objections which the fundamental idealism of the view I have adopted might encounter. Section 19. Immediate presence of representations. Now as, notwithstanding this union through the understanding of the forms of the inner and outer sense in representing matter, and with it a permanent outer world, all immediate knowledge is nevertheless acquired by the subject through the inner sense alone, the outer sense being again object for the inner, which in its turn perceives the perceptions of the outer, and as therefore with respect to the immediate presence of representations in its consciousness, the subject remains under the rule of time alone, as the form of the inner sense. It follows that only one representation can be present to it, the subject, at the same time, although that one may be very complicated. When we speak of representations as immediately present, we mean that they are not only known in the union of time and space affected by the understanding, an intuitive faculty, as we shall soon see, through which the collective representation of empirical reality arises, but that they are known in mere time alone, as representations of the inner sense, and just at the neutral point at which its two currents separate, called the present. The necessary condition mentioned in the preceding paragraph for the immediate presence of a representation of this class is its causal action upon our senses, and consequently upon our organism, which itself belongs to this class of objects, and is therefore subject to the causal law which predominates in it, and which we are now about to examine. Now, as therefore, on the one hand, according to the laws of the inner and outer world, the subject cannot stop short at that one representation, but as, on the other hand, there is no coexistence in time alone, that single representation must always vanish and be superseded by others, in virtue of a law which we cannot determine a priori, but which depends upon circumstances soon to be mentioned. It is, moreover, a well-known fact that the imagination and dreams reproduce the immediate presence of representations. The investigation of that fact, however, belongs to empirical psychology. Now, as notwithstanding the transitory, isolated nature of our representations with respect to their immediate presence in our consciousness, the subject nevertheless retains the representation of an all-comprehensive complex of reality, as described above, by means of the function of the understanding. Representations have, on the strength of this antithesis, been viewed as something quite different when considered as belonging to that complex than when considered with reference to their immediate presence in our consciousness. From the former point of view they were called real things, from the latter only representations par excellence. This view of the matter, which is the ordinary one, is known under the name of realism. On the appearance of modern philosophy, idealism opposed itself to this realism, and has since been steadily gaining ground. Malebranche and Berkeley were its earliest representatives, and Kant enhanced it to the power of transcendental idealism, by which the coexistence of the empirical reality of things with their transcendental ideality becomes conceivable, and according to which Kant expresses himself as follows. Transcendental idealism teaches that all phenomena are representations only, not things by themselves. And again, space itself is nothing but mere representation, and whatever is in it must therefore be contained in that representation. There is nothing whatever in space, except so far as it is really represented in it. Finally, he says, if we take away the thinking subject, the whole material world must vanish, because it is nothing but a phenomenon in the sensibility of our own subject, and a certain class of its representations. In India, idealism is even a doctrine of popular religion, not only of Brahmanism, but of Buddhism. In Europe alone is it a paradox, in consequence of the essentially and unavoidably realistic principle of Judaism. But realism quite overlooks the fact that the so-called existence of these real things is absolutely nothing but their being represented, ein vorgestellt werden, or, if it be insisted, that only the immediate presence in the consciousness of the subject can be called being represented actually, it is even only a possibility of being represented potentially. The realist forgets that the object ceases to be object apart from its reference to the subject, and that if we take away that reference, or think it away, we at once do away with all objective existence. Leibniz, while he clearly felt the subject to be the necessary condition for the object, was nevertheless unable to get rid of the thought that objects exist by themselves, and independently of all reference whatsoever to the subject, i.e., independently of being represented. He therefore assumed, in the first place, a world of objects exactly like the world of representations, and running parallel with it, having no direct but only an outward connection with it by means of a harmonia praestabilita, pre-established harmony. Obviously the most superfluous thing possible, for it never comes within perception, and the precisely similar world of representations, which does come within perception, goes its own way regardless of it. When, however, he wanted to determine more closely the essence of these things existing objectively in themselves, he found himself obliged to declare the objects in themselves to be subjects, monades, and by doing so he furnished the most striking proof of the inability of our consciousness, in as far as it is merely cognitive, to find, within the limits of the intellect, i.e. of the apparatus by means of which we represent the world, anything beyond subject and object, the representer and the represented. Therefore, if we abstract from the objectivity of an object, or, in other words, from its being represented, vorgestellt werden, if we annul it in its quality as an object, yet still wish to retain something, we can meet with nothing but the subject. Conversely, if we desire to abstract from the subjectivity of the subject, yet to have something over, the contrary takes place, and this leads to materialism. Spinoza, who never thoroughly sifted the matter, and never therefore acquired a clear notion of it, nevertheless quite understood the necessary correlation between subject and object as so essential that they are inconceivable without it. Consequently, he defined it as an identity in the substance, which alone exists, of that which knows, with that which has extension. Observation. With reference to the chief argument of this paragraph, I take the opportunity to remark that if, in the course of this treatise, for the sake of brevity, and in order to be more easily understood, I at any time use the term real objects, I mean by it nothing but the intuitive representations that are united to form the complex of empirical reality, which reality in itself always remains ideal. Section 20. Principle of sufficient reason of becoming. In the class of objects for the subject just described, the principle of sufficient reason figures as the law of causality, and as such I call it the principle of sufficient reason of becoming, principium rationis sufficientis fiendi. By it, all objects presenting themselves within the entire range of our representation are linked together, as far as the appearance and disappearance of their states is concerned, i.e., in the movement of the current of time, to form the complex of empirical reality. The law of causality is as follows. When one or several real objects pass into any new state, some other state must have preceded this one, upon which the new state regularly follows, i.e., as often as that preceding one occurs. This sort of following we call resulting, the first of the states being named a cause, the second an effect. When a substance takes fire, for instance, this state of ignition must have been preceded by a state, 1. Of affinity to oxygen, 2. Of contact with oxygen, 3. Of a given temperature. Now, as ignition must necessarily follow immediately upon this state, and as it has only just taken place, that state cannot always have been there, but must, on the contrary, have only just supervened. This supervening is called a change. It is on this account that the law of causality stands in exclusive relation to changes, and has to do with them alone. Every effect at the time it takes place is a change, and precisely by not having occurred sooner, infallibly indicates some other change by which it has been preceded. That other change takes the name of cause, when referred to the following one, of effect, when referred to a third necessarily preceding change. This is the chain of causality. It is necessarily without a beginning. By it, each supervening state must have resulted from a preceding change. In the case just mentioned, for instance, from the substance being brought into contact with free heat, from which necessarily resulted the heightened temperature. This contact again depended upon a preceding change, for instance the sun's rays falling upon a burning glass. This again upon the removal of a cloud from before the sun, this upon the wind upon the unequal density of the atmosphere, this upon other conditions, and so forth, in infinitum. When a state contains all the requisite conditions for bringing about a new state, excepting one, this one, when at last it arrives, is, in a sense, rightly called the cause par excellence, inasmuch as we here have the final, in this case the decisive, change, especially in view. But if we leave out this consideration, no single condition of the causal state has any advantage over the rest with reference to the determination of the causal connection in general, merely because it happens to be the last. Thus, the removal of the cloud in the above example is insofar the cause of the igniting, as it took place later than the direction of the burning glass towards the object. But this might have taken place after the removal of the cloud, and the addition of oxygen might have occurred later still. In this respect, therefore, it is the accidental order of things that determines which is the cause. On closer inspection, however, we find that it is the entire state which is the cause of the ensuing one, so that the chronological order in which its single conditions were brought about is in all essential respects indifferent. With reference to a given case, therefore, the last occurring condition of a state may be called the cause par excellence, because it completes the measure of the necessary conditions, and its appearance thus becomes the decisive change. For purposes of general consideration, however, it is only the entire state which, by bringing about its successor, can be regarded as the cause. The single requisites which, added together, complete and constitute the cause may be called causal elements, ursächliche Momente, or even conditions, and into these, accordingly, the cause may be subdivided. On the other hand, it is quite wrong to call the objects themselves causes, instead of the states. Some would, for instance, call the burning glass in the above example the cause of the ignition, while others again would call the cloud the cause, others the sun or the oxygen, and so on arbitrarily and without order. But it is absurd to call an object the cause of another object. First of all, because objects not only contain form and quality, but matter also, which has neither beginning or end. Secondly, because the law of causality refers exclusively to changes, i.e. to the entrance and exit of states in time, wherein it regulates that special relation, in reference to which the earlier state is called cause, the later effect, and the necessary connection between both, the resulting of the one from the other. I here refer the thoughtful reader to the explanations I have given in my chief work, for it is of the highest importance that our conception of the true and proper meaning of the law of causality and the sphere of its validity should be perfectly clear and definite. Before all things, that we should recognize that this law refers solely and exclusively to changes of material states, and to nothing else whatever. Consequently, that it ought not to be brought in when these are not in question. The law of causality is the regulator of the changes undergone in time by objects of our outer experience, but these objects are all material. Each change can only be brought about by another having preceded it, which is determined by a rule, and then the new change takes place as being necessarily induced by the preceding one. This necessity is the causal nexus. However simple, therefore, the law of causality is, we nevertheless find it expressed quite differently in all philosophical manuals, from the earliest down to the latest ages, namely, in a broader, more abstract, therefore less definite way. We are, for instance, informed now that it is that by which something else comes into being, now that it is what produces another thing or gives it reality, etc., etc. Wolff says, the cause is the principle on which the existence or actuality of another entity depends, whereas it is obvious that in causality we have only to do with changes in the form of uncreated, indestructible matter, and that a springing into existence of what did not previously exist is an impossibility. Want of clearness of thought may, no doubt, in most cases have led to these views of the causal relation, but surely sometimes an arrière-pensée lurks in the background, a theological intention coquetting with the cosmological proof, for whose sake it is ready to falsify even transcendental a priori truths, the mother's milk of human understanding. We find the clearest instance of this in Thomas Brown's book On the Relation of Cause and Effect, a work of 460 pages, which, in 1835, had already reached its 4th edition, and has probably since gone through several more, and which, in spite of its wearisome, pedantic, rambling prolixity, does not handle the subject badly. Now, this Englishman rightly recognizes that it is invariably with changes that the causal law has to do, and that every effect is accordingly a change. Yet, although it can hardly have escaped him, he is unwilling to admit that every cause is likewise a change, and that the whole process is therefore nothing but the uninterrupted nexus of changes succeeding one another in time. On the contrary, he persists in clumsily calling the cause an object or substance which precedes the change, and in tormenting himself throughout his tedious book with this entirely false expression, which spoils all his explanations, notwithstanding his own better knowledge and against his conscience, simply in order that his definition may on no account stand in the way of the cosmological proof which others might hereafter state elsewhere. But what can a truth be worth which needs devices such as these to prepare its way? And what have our own worthy, honest German professors of philosophy been doing in behalf of their dearly beloved cosmological proof, since Kant dealt it the death blow in his Critique of Pure Reason? They, who prize truth above everything? They were indeed at their wits' ends, for as these worthies well know, though they do not say so, causa prima is just as well as causa sui, a contradictio in adjecto, a logical inconsistency between a noun and its modifying adjective, albeit the former expression is more generally used than the latter. It is, besides, usually pronounced with a very serious, not to say solemn air. Nay, many people, especially English reverends, turn up their eyes in a truly edifying way when they impressively and emphatically mention that contradictio in adjecto, the first cause. They know that a first cause is just as inconceivable as the point at which space ends or the moment when time first began. For every cause is a change, which necessarily obliges us to ask for the preceding change that brought it about, and so on, in infinitum, in infinitum. Even a first state of matter from which, as it has ceased to be, all following states could have proceeded, is inconceivable. For if this state had in itself been the cause of the following ones, they must likewise have existed from all eternity, and the actual state existing at the present moment could not have only just now come into being. If, on the other hand, that first state only began to be causal at some given period, something or other must have changed it, for its inactivity to have ceased. But then something must have occurred, some change must have taken place, and this again obliges us to ask for its cause, i.e. a change which preceded it, and here we are once more on the causal ladder up which we are whipped step by step, higher and higher, in infinitum, in infinitum. These gentlemen will surely not have the face to talk to me of matter itself arising out of nothing. If so, they will find corollaries at their service further on. The causal law, therefore, is not so accommodating as to let itself be used like a hired cab, which we dismiss when we have reached our destination. Rather does it resemble the broom brought to life by the apprentice wizard in Goethe's poem, which, when once set in motion, does not leave off running and fetching water until the old master wizard himself stops it, which he alone has the power to do. These gentlemen, however, have no master wizards among them. So what did they do, these noble, genuine lovers of truth, ever on the alert, of course, to proclaim the advent of real merit to the world as soon as it shows itself in their profession, who, far from wishing to divert attention from the works of those who are really what they only seem to be, by craftily ignoring and meanly keeping them dark, are naturally foremost to acknowledge their worth. Aye, surely as folly loves wisdom above everything. What did they do, I say, to help their old friend, the sorely distressed cosmological proof, now at its last gasp? Oh, they hit upon a shrewd device. "Friend," they said, "you are in sorry plight since your fatal encounter with that stubborn old man in Königsberg, and indeed your brethren, the ontological and physico-theological proofs, are in no better condition. Never mind, you shall not be abandoned by us. That is what we are paid for, you know. Only you must alter your dress and your name. There is no help for it, for if we call you by your right name, everyone will take to his heels. Now, incognito, on the contrary, we can take you by the arm and once more lead you into society. Only, as we have just said, it must be incognito. That is sure to answer. First of all, your argument must henceforth be called the absolute. This has a foreign, dignified, aristocratic ring, and no one knows better than we do all that can be done with Germans by assuming airs of importance. Of course, all know what the real meaning is, and pique themselves upon that knowledge. But you yourself must come forward disguised, in the form of an enthymeme. Be sure and leave behind you all those prosyllogisms and premises by which you used to drag us wearily up the long climax, for everyone knows how utterly useless they are. Come forward with a bold face and a self-sufficient supercilious air, like a man of few words, and at one bound you will reach the goal. Exclaim, and we will chime in, "The absolute, confound it! That must exist, or there would be nothing at all. Here strike the table with your fist. Whence does the absolute come? What a silly question! Did not I tell you it was the absolute? That will do, forsooth, that will do." Germans are accustomed to content themselves with words instead of thoughts. Do we not train them to it from their cradle? Only look at Hegelianism. What is it but empty, hollow, nauseous twaddle? Yet how brilliant a career was that of this philosophical time-server! A few mercenary individuals had only to strike up a laudation of this stuff, and they at once found an echo to their voices in the empty hollow of 1,000 numbskulls, an echo which still continues to resound and to extend. And behold, an ordinary intellect, a common impostor, soon became a sublime thinker. Take heart, therefore. Besides, our friend and patron, we will also second you in other ways, for how indeed are we to get a living without you? So that carping old fault-finder, Kant, has been criticizing reason and clipping her wings, has he? Well, then, we will invent a new sort of reason, such as has never been heard of, a reason that does not think, but which has direct intuition, a reason which sees ideas, a high-flown word made to mystify, sees them bodily, or which apprehends directly that which you and others seek to prove, or again, a reason which has forebodings of all this last for the benefit of those who do not care to make large concessions, but also are satisfied with very little. Let us thus pass off early inculcated popular conceptions for direct revelations of this new kind of reason, i.e. for inspirations from above. As for that old-fashioned reason, which criticism has criticized away, let us degrade it, call it understanding, and send it about its business. Well, and what is to become of real, true understanding? What in the world have we to do with real, true understanding? You smile incredulously, but we know our listeners, and the old song, Harum Horum, we see on the students' benches before us. Bacon of Verulam already in his time said, "Young men learn to believe at universities." Of this they can learn as much as they wish from us. We have a good stock of articles of faith on hand. Should any misgivings assail you, remember that we are in Germany, where what would have been impossible in any other country has been found possible, where a dull-witted, ignorant pseudo-philosopher whose ineffably hollow verbiage disorganizes people's brains completely and permanently, a scribbler of nonsense, I am speaking of our dearly beloved Hegel, has not only been actually proclaimed a profound thinker with impunity, and even without incurring ridicule, but is readily accepted as such. Yes, indeed, for this fiction has found credence for the last 30 years, and is believed to this day. Once, therefore, we have this absolute with your help, we are quite safe, in spite of Kant and his critique. We may then philosophize in a lofty tone, making the universe proceed from the absolute by means of the most heterogeneous deductions, one more tiresome than the other, this, by the way, being their only point of resemblance. We can call the world the finite and the absolute the infinite, thus giving an agreeable variety to our nonsense, and talk of nothing but God, explaining how, why, wherefore, by what voluntary or involuntary process he created or brought forth the world, showing whether he be within or without it, and so forth, as if philosophy were theology, and as if it sought for enlightenment concerning God, not concerning the universe. The cosmological proof with which we here have to do, and to which the above apostrophe is addressed, consists thus, properly speaking, in the assertion that the principle of the sufficient reason of becoming, or the law of causality, necessarily leads to a thought which destroys it, and declares it to be null and void. For the causa prima, the absolute, can only be reached by proceeding upwards from consequence to reason, through a series prolonged ad libitum, but it is impossible to stop short at the causa prima without at once annulling the principle of sufficient reason. Having thus briefly and clearly shown the nullity of the cosmological proof, as I had in my second chapter already shown the nullity of the ontological proof, the sympathizing reader may perhaps expect me to do the same with respect to the physico-theological proof, which is a great deal more plausible. As, however, this belongs by its nature to a different department of philosophy, it would be quite out of place here. I therefore refer him to Kant's critique of pure reason, as well as to his critique of the faculty of judgment, where he treats this subject ex professo, according to plan. I likewise refer him, as a complement to Kant's purely negative procedure, to my own positive one in The Will in Nature, a work which, though small in bulk, is rich and weighty in content. As for the indifferent reader, he is free to let this and indeed all my writings pass down unread to his descendants. It matters not to me, for I am here not for one generation only, but for many. Now, as the law of causality is known to us a priori, and is therefore a transcendental law, applicable to every possible experience, and consequently without exception, as will be shown in section 21, as, moreover, it decides that upon a given, definite, relatively first state, a second, equally definite one inevitably ensues by rule, i.e. always, the relation between cause and effect is a necessary one, so that the causal law authorizes us to form hypothetical judgments, and thereby shows itself to be a form of the principle of sufficient reason, upon which principle all judgments must be founded, and, as will be shown further on, all necessity is based. This form of our principle I call the principle of the sufficient reason of becoming, because its application invariably presupposes a change, the entering upon a new state, consequently a becoming. One of its essential characteristics is this, that the cause always precedes the effect in time. Compare section 47. And this alone gives us the original criterion by which to distinguish which is cause and which effect, of two states linked together by the causal nexus. Conversely, in some cases the causal nexus is known to us through former experience, but the rapidity with which the different states follow upon each other is so great that the order in which this happens escapes our perception. We then conclude with complete certitude from causality to succession. Thus, for instance, we infer that the igniting of gunpowder precedes its explosion. From this essential connection between causality and succession, it follows that the conception of reciprocity, strictly speaking, has no meaning, for it presumes the effect to be again the cause of its cause, that is, that what follows is at the same time what precedes. In a critique of Kantian philosophy, which I have added to my chief work, and to which I refer my readers, I have shown at length that this favourite conception is inadmissible. It may be remarked that authors usually have recourse to it just when their insight is becoming less clear, and this accounts for the frequency of its use. Nay, it is precisely when a writer comes to the end of his conceptions that the word reciprocity presents itself more readily than any other. It may, in fact, be looked upon as a kind of alarm gun, denoting that the author has got out of his depth. It is also worthy of remark that the word Wechselwirkung, literally reciprocal action, or, as we have preferred translating it, reciprocity, is only found in the German language, and that there is no precise equivalent for it in daily use in any other tongue. From the law of causality spring two corollaries which, in virtue of this origin, are accredited as cognitions a priori, therefore as unquestionable and without exception. They are the law of inertia and that of permanence of substance. The first of these laws avers that every state in which a body can possibly be, consequently that of repose, as well as that of any kind of movement, must last for ever without change, diminution, or augmentation, unless some cause supervenes to alter or annul it. But the other law by which the eternity of matter is affirmed results from the fact that the law of causality is exclusively applicable to states of bodies, such as repose, movement, form, and quality, since it presides over their temporal passing in or out of being, but that it is by no means applicable to the existence of that which endures these states, and is called substance, in order precisely to express its exemption from all arising and perishing. Substance is permanent means that it can neither pass into nor out of being, so that its quantity existing in the universe can neither be increased nor diminished. That we know this a priori is proved by the consciousness of unassailable certainty with which, when we see a body disappear, whether it be by conjuring, by minute subdivision, by combustion, volatilization, or indeed any process whatever, we all nevertheless firmly assume that its substance, i.e. its matter, must still exist somewhere or other in undiminished quantity, whatever may have become of its form. Likewise, when we perceive a body suddenly in a place where it was not before, that it must have been brought there, or formed by some combination of invisible particles, for instance by precipitation, but that it, i.e. its substance, cannot have then started into existence, for this implies a total impossibility, and is utterly inconceivable. The certainty with which we assume this beforehand, a priori, proceeds from the fact that our understanding possesses absolutely no form under which to conceive the beginning and end of matter. For, as before said, the law of causality, the only form in which we are able to conceive changes at all, is solely applicable to states of bodies, and never under any circumstances to the existence of that which undergoes all changes, matter. This is why I place the principle of the permanence of matter among the corollaries of the causal law. Moreover, we cannot have acquired a posteriori the conviction that substance is permanent, partly because it cannot, in most instances, be empirically established, partly also because every empirical knowledge obtained exclusively by means of induction has only approximate, consequently precarious, never unconditioned certainty. The firmness of our persuasion as to this principle is therefore of a different kind and nature from our security of conviction with regard to the accuracy of any empirically discovered law of nature, since it has an entirely different, perfectly unshakable, never vacillating firmness. The reason of this is that the principle expresses a transcendental knowledge, i.e. one which determines and fixes, prior to all experience, what is in any way possible within the whole range of experience, but precisely by this it reduces the world of experience to a mere cerebral phenomenon. Even the most universal among the non-transcendental laws of nature, and the one least liable to exception, the law of gravitation, is of empirical origin, consequently without guarantee as to its absolute universality. Wherefore it is still from time to time called in question, and doubts occasionally arise as to its validity beyond our solar system, and astronomers carefully call attention to any indications corroborative of its doubtfulness with which they may happen to meet, thereby showing that they regard it as merely empirical. The question may of course be raised whether gravitation takes effect between bodies which are separated by an absolute vacuum, or whether its action within a solar system may not be mediated by some sort of ether, and may not cease altogether between fixed stars. But these questions only admit of an empirical solution, and this proves that here we have not to do with a knowledge a priori. If, on the other hand, we admit with Kant and Laplace the hypothesis, as the most probable one, that each solar system has developed out of an original nebula by a gradual process of condensation, we still cannot for a moment conceive the possibility of that original substance having sprung into being out of nothing. We are forced to assume the anterior existence of its particles somewhere or other, as well as their having been brought together somehow or other, precisely because of the transcendental nature of the principle of the permanence of substance. In my critique of Kantian philosophy, I have shown at length that substance is but another word for matter, the conception of substance not being realizable except in matter, and therefore deriving its origin from matter. And I have also specially pointed out that conception was formed solely to serve a surreptitious purpose. Like many other equally certain truths, this eternity of matter, called the permanence of substance, is forbidden fruit for professors of philosophy, so they slip past it with a bashful, sidelong glance. By the endless chain of causes and effects which directs all changes, but never extends beyond them, two existing things remain untouched, precisely because of the limited range of its action. On the one hand, matter, as we have just shown, on the other hand, the primary forces of nature. The first, matter, remains uninfluenced by the causal nexus, because it is that which undergoes all changes, or on which they take place. The second, the primary forces, because it is they alone by which changes or effects become possible, for they alone give causality to causes, i.e. the faculty of operating, which the causes therefore hold as mere vassals, a fief. Cause and effect are changes connected together to necessary succession in time, whereas the forces of nature, by means of which all causes operate, are exempt from all change. In this sense, therefore, they are outside time, but precisely on that account they are always and everywhere in reserve, omnipresent and inexhaustible, ever ready to manifest themselves as soon as an opportunity presents itself in the thread of causality. A cause, like its effect, is invariably something individual, a single change, whereas a force of nature is something universal, unchangeable, present at all times and in all places. The attraction of a thread by amber, for instance, at the present moment, is an effect. Its cause is the preceding friction and actual contact of the amber with the thread, and the force of nature which acts in and presides over the process is electricity. The explanation of this matter is to be found in my chief work, and there I have shown in a long chain of causes and effects how the most heterogeneous natural forces successively come into play in them. By this explanation the difference between transitory phenomena and permanent forms of operation becomes exceedingly clear, and as, moreover, a whole section, section 26, is devoted to the question, it will be sufficient here to give a brief sketch of it. The rule by which a force of nature manifests itself in the chain of causes and effects, consequently the link which connects it with them, is the law of nature. But the confusion between forces of nature and causes is as frequent as it is detrimental to clearness of thought. It seems indeed as though no one had accurately defined the difference between these conceptions before me, however great may have been the urgency for such a distinction. Not only are forces of nature turned into causes by such expressions as electricity, gravity, etc., are the cause of so-and-so, but they are even often turned into effects by those who search for a cause for electricity, gravity, etc., etc., which is absurd. Diminishing the number of the forces of nature, however, by reducing one to another, as for instance magnetism is in our days reduced to electricity, is a totally different thing. Every true, consequently really primary force of nature, and every fundamental chemical property belongs to these forces, is essentially a qualitas occulta, hidden quality, i.e., it does not admit of physical but only of metaphysical explanation, in other words, of an explanation which transcends the world of phenomena. No one has carried this confusion, or rather identification, of causes with forces of nature further than Maine de Biran in his Nouvelle considération des rapports du physique au moral, for it is essential to his philosophy. It is, besides, remarkable that when he speaks of causes he rarely uses the word cause alone, but almost always speaks of cause ou force, just as we have seen Spinoza above, section 8, write ratio sive causa, reason or cause, no less than 8 times in the same page. Both writers are evidently conscious that they are identifying two disparates in order to be able to make use of the one or the other, according to circumstances. For this end, they are obliged to keep the identification constantly before their reader's mind. Now, causality, as the director of each and every change, presents itself in nature under 3 distinct forms: as causes, in the strictest acceptation of the word, as stimuli, and as motives. It is just upon this difference that the real, essential distinction between inorganic bodies, plants and animals is based, and not upon external anatomical, let alone chemical, distinctions. A cause, in its narrowest sense, is that upon which changes in the inorganic kingdom alone ensue. Those changes, that is to say, which form the theme of mechanics, physics, and chemistry. Newton's third fundamental law, action and reaction are equal to one another, applies exclusively to this cause, and enunciates that the state which precedes, the cause, undergoes a change equivalent to that produced by it, the effect. In this form of causality alone, moreover, does the degree of the effect always exactly correspond to the degree of the cause, so as to enable us accurately to calculate the one by means of the other. The second form of causality is the stimulus. It reigns over organic life as such, i.e., over plant life and the vegetative, that is, the unconscious part of animal life. This second form is characterized by the absence of the distinctive signs of the first. In it, accordingly, action and reaction are not equal, nor does the intensity of the effect by any means correspond, throughout all its degrees, to the intensity of the cause. In fact, the opposite effect may even be produced by intensifying the cause. The third form of causality is the motive. Under this form, causality rules animal life proper, that is, the exterior, consciously performed actions of all animals. The medium for motives is knowledge. An intellect is accordingly needed for susceptibility to motives. The true characteristic of the animal is therefore the faculty of knowing, of representing, das Vorstellen. Animals as such always move towards some aim and end, which therefore must have been recognized by them. That is to say, it must have presented itself to them as something different from themselves, yet of which they are conscious. Therefore the proper definition of the animal would be that which knows, for no other definition quite hits the mark, or can even perhaps stand the test of investigation. Movement induced by motives is necessarily wanting where there is no cognitive faculty, and movement by stimuli alone remains, i.e., plant life. Irritability and sensibility are therefore inseparable. Still, motives evidently act in a different way from stimuli, for the action of the former may be very brief, nay, need only be momentary, since their efficacy, unlike that of stimuli, stands in no relation whatever to the duration of that action, to the proximity of the object, etc., etc. A motive needs but to be perceived, therefore, to take effect, whereas stimuli always require outward, often even inward, contact, and invariably a certain length of time. This short sketch of the three forms of causality will suffice here. They are more fully described in my prize essay on free will. One thing, however, still remains to be urged. The difference between cause, stimulus, and motive is obviously only a consequence of the various degrees of receptivity of beings. The greater their receptivity, the feebler may be the nature of the influence. A stone needs an impact, while man obeys a look. Nevertheless, both are moved by a sufficient cause, therefore with the same necessity. For motivation is only causality passing through knowledge. The intellect is the medium of the motives, because it is the highest degree of receptivity. By this, however, the law of causality loses nothing whatever of its rigour and certainty, for motives are causes and operate with the same necessity which all causes bring with them. This necessity is easy to perceive in animals, because of the greater simplicity of their intellect, which is limited to the perception of what is present. Man's intellect is double, for not only has he intuitive but abstract knowledge, which last is not limited to what is present. Man possesses reason. He therefore has a power of elective decision with clear consciousness. That is, he is able to weigh against one another motives which exclude each other, as such. In other terms, he can let them try their strength on his will. The most powerful motive then decides him, and his actions ensue with just the same necessity as the rolling of a ball after it has been struck. Freedom of will means, not professorial twaddle, but that a given human being, in a given situation, can act in two different ways. But the utter absurdity of this assertion is a truth as certain and as clearly proved as any truth can be which passes the limits of pure mathematics. In my essay on free will, to which the Norwegian Society awarded the prize, this truth is demonstrated more clearly, methodically, and thoroughly than has been done before by anyone else, and this, moreover, with special reference to those facts of our consciousness by which ignorant people imagine that absurdity to be confirmed. In all that is essential, however, Hobbes, Spinoza, Priestley, Voltaire, and even Kant already taught the same doctrine. Our professional philosophers, of course, do not let this interfere with their holding forth on free will, as if it were an understood thing which had never been questioned. But what do these gentlemen imagine the above-named great men to have come into the world for, by the grace of nature? To enable them, the professors, to earn their livelihood by philosophy? Since I had proved this truth in my prize essay more clearly than had ever been done before, and since, moreover, a Royal Society had sanctioned that proof by placing my essay amongst its memoranda, it surely behoved these worthies, considering the views they held, to make a vigorous attack upon so pernicious a doctrine, so detestable a heresy, and thoroughly to refute it. Nay, this duty was all the more imperative, as in my other essay, on the foundation of morality, I had proved the utter groundlessness of Kant's practical reason, with its categorical imperative, which, under the name of the moral law, is still used by these gentlemen as the cornerstone of their own shallow systems of morality. I have shown it to be a futile assumption so clearly and irrefutably that no one with a spark of judgment can possibly believe any longer in this fiction. Well, and so they probably did. Oh no, they take good care not to venture on such slippery ground. Their ability consists in holding their tongues. Silence is all they have to oppose to intelligence, earnestness, and truth. In not one of the products of their useless scribblings that have appeared since 1841 has the slightest notice been taken of my ethics, undoubtedly the most important work on moral philosophy that has been published for the last 60 years. Nay, their terror of me and of my truth is so great that none of the literary journals issued by academies or universities has so much as mentioned the book. Zitto, zitto, hush, hush, lest the public should perceive anything. In this consists the whole of their policy. The instinct of self-preservation may, no doubt, be at the bottom of these artful tactics. For would not a philosophy, whose sole aim was truth, and which had no other consideration in view, be likely to play the part of the iron pot among the earthen ones, were it to come in contact with the petty systems composed under the influence of 1,000 personal considerations by people whose chief qualification is the propriety of their sentiments? Their wretched fear of my writings is the fear of truth, nor can it be denied that precisely this very doctrine of the complete necessity of all acts of the will stands in flagrant contradiction with all the hypotheses of their favourite old woman's philosophy cut after the pattern of Judaism. Still, that severely tested truth, far from being disturbed by all this as a sure datum and criterion, give me a foothold and I shall move the earth, attributed to Archimedes, proves the futility of all that old woman's philosophy, and the urgent need of a fundamentally different, incomparably deeper view of the universe and of man, no matter whether that view be compatible with the official duties of a professional philosopher or not. Section 21. A priori character of the conception of causality, intellectual character of empirical perception. The understanding. In the professorial philosophy of our philosophy professors, we are still taught to this day that perception of the outer world is a thing of the senses, and then there follows a long dissertation upon each of the 5 senses, whereas no mention whatever is made of the intellectual character of perception, that is to say, of the fact that it is mainly the work of the understanding, which, by means of its own peculiar form of causality, together with the forms of pure sensibility, time and space, which are postulated by causality, primarily creates and produces the objective outer world out of the raw material of a few sensations. And yet, in its principal features, I had stated this matter in the first edition of the present treatise, and soon after developed it more fully in my treatise On Vision and Colours, 1816, of which Professor Rosas has shown his appreciation by allowing it to lead him into plagiarism. But our professors of philosophy have not thought fit to take the slightest notice either of this or indeed of any of the other great and important truths which it has been the aim and labour of my whole life to set forth, in order to secure them as a lasting possession to mankind. It does not suit their tastes or fit into their notions. It leads to no theology, nor is it even adapted to drill students for higher state purposes. In short, professional philosophers do not care to learn from me, nor do they even see how much they might learn from me, that is, all that their children and their children's children will learn from me. They prefer to sit down and spin a long metaphysical yarn, each out of his own thoughts, for the benefit of the public, and no doubt if fingers are a sufficient qualification, they have it. How right was Machiavelli when he said, as Hesiod before him, there are 3 sorts of heads. Firstly, those which acquire knowledge of things and comprehend them by themselves. Secondly, those which recognize the truth when it is shown them by others. And thirdly, those which can do neither the one nor the other. One must indeed be forsaken by all the gods to imagine that the outer perceptible world, filling space in its 3 dimensions and moving on in the inexorable flow of time, governed at every step by the laws of causality, which is without exception, and in all this merely obeying laws, we can indicate before all experience of them that such a world as this, we say, can have a real, objective existence outside us, without any agency of our own, and that it can then have found its way into our heads through bare sensation, and thus have a second existence within us like the one outside. For what a miserably poor thing is mere sensation after all. Even in the noblest of our organs, it is nothing but a local, specific feeling, susceptible of some slight variation, still in itself always subjective, and as such, therefore, incapable of containing anything objective, anything like perception. For sensation is and remains a process within the organism, and is limited as such to the region within the skin. It cannot therefore contain anything which lies beyond that region, or in other words, anything that is outside us. A sensation may be pleasant or unpleasant, which betokens a relation to the will, but nothing objective can ever lie in any sensation. In the organs of the senses, sensation is heightened by the confluence of the nerve extremities, and can easily be excited from without on account of their extensive distribution, and the delicacy of the envelope which encloses them. It is, besides, specially susceptible to particular influences, such as light, sound, smell, notwithstanding which it is and remains mere sensation, like all others within our body, consequently something essentially subjective, of whose changes we only become immediately conscious in the form of the inner sense, time, that is, successively. It is only when the understanding begins to act, a function not of single delicate nerve extremities, but of that mysterious complicated structure weighing from 5 to 10 pounds, called the brain. Only when it begins to apply its sole form, the causal law, that a powerful transformation takes place, by which subjective sensation becomes objective perception. For in virtue of its own peculiar form, therefore a priori, i.e. before all experience, since there could have been none till then, the understanding conceives the given corporeal sensation as an effect, a word which the understanding alone comprehends, which effect, as such, necessarily implies a cause. Simultaneously, it summons to its assistance space, the form of the outer sense, lying likewise ready in the intellect, i.e. the brain, in order to remove that cause beyond the organism. For it is by this that the external world first arises, space alone rendering it possible, so that pure intuition a priori has to supply the foundation for empirical perception. In this process, as I shall soon show more clearly, the understanding avails itself of all the several data, even the minutest, which are presented to it by the given sensation, in order to construct the cause of it in space in conformity with them. This intellectual operation, which is, moreover, explicitly denied both by Schelling and by Fries, does not, however, take place discursively or reflectively, in abstracto, by means of conceptions and words. It is, on the contrary, an intuitive and quite direct process. For by it alone, therefore exclusively, in the understanding and for the understanding, does the real, objective, corporeal world, filling space in its 3 dimensions, present itself and further proceed, according to the same law of causality, to change in time and to move in space. It is therefore the understanding itself which has to create the objective world, for this world cannot walk into our brain from outside already cut and dried through the senses and the openings of their organs. In fact, the senses supply nothing but the raw materials which the understanding at once proceeds to work up into the objective view of a corporeal world, subject to regular laws, by means of the simple forms we have indicated, space, time, and causality. Accordingly, our everyday empirical perception is an intellectual one, and has a right to claim this predicate, which German pseudo-philosophers have given to a pretended intuition of dream worlds, in which their beloved absolute is supposed to perform its evolutions. And now I will proceed to show how wide is the gulf which separates sensation from perception, by pointing out how raw is the material out of which the beautiful edifice is constructed. Objective perception makes use, properly speaking, of only two senses, touch and sight. These alone supply the data upon which, as its basis, the understanding constructs the objective world by the process just described. The three other senses remain on the whole subjective, for their sensations, while pointing to an external cause, still contain no data by which its relations in space can be determined. Now space is the form of all perception, i.e. of that apprehension in which alone objects can, properly speaking, present themselves. Therefore those other three senses can no doubt serve to announce the presence of objects we already know in some other way, but no construction in space, consequently no objective perception, can possibly be founded on their data. A rose cannot be constructed from its perfume, and a blind man may hear music all his life without having the slightest objective representation either of the musicians, or of the instruments, or of the vibrations of the air. On the other hand, the sense of hearing is of great value as a medium for language, and through this it is the sense of reason. It is also valuable as a medium for music, which is the only way in which we comprehend numerical relations not only in abstracto, but directly in concreto. A musical sound or tone, however, gives no clue to spatial relations. Therefore it never helps to bring the nature of its cause nearer to us. We stop short at it, so that it is no datum for the understanding in its construction of the objective world. The sensations of touch and sight alone are such data. Therefore a blind man without either hands or feet, while able to construct space for himself a priori in all its regularity, would nevertheless acquire but a very vague representation of the objective world. Yet what is supplied by touch and sight is not by any means perception, but merely the raw material for it. For perception is so far from being contained in the sensations of touch and sight, that these sensations have not even the faintest resemblance to the qualities of the things which present themselves to us through them, as I shall presently show. Only what really belongs to sensation must first be clearly distinguished from what is added to it by the intellect in perception. In the beginning this is not easy, because we are so accustomed to pass from the sensation at once to its cause, that the cause presents itself to us without our noticing the sensation apart from it, by which, as it were, the premises are supplied to this conclusion drawn by the understanding. Thus touch and sight have each their own special advantages, to begin with. Therefore they assist each other mutually. Sight needs no contact, nor even proximity. Its field is unbounded, and extends to the stars. It is, moreover, sensitive to the most delicate degrees of light, shade, colour, and transparency, so that it supplies the understanding with a quantity of nicely defined data, out of which, by dint of practice, it becomes able to construct the shape, size, distance, and nature of bodies, and represents them at once perceptibly. On the other hand, touch certainly depends upon contact. Still, its data are so varied and so trustworthy that it is the most searching of all the senses. Even perception by sight may, in the last resort, be referred to touch. Nay, sight may be looked upon as an imperfect touch extending to a great distance, which uses the rays of light as long feelers, and it is just because it is limited to those qualities which have light for their medium, and is therefore one-sided, that it is so liable to deception, whereas touch supplies the data for cognizing size, shape, hardness, softness, roughness, temperature, etc., etc., quite immediately. In this it is assisted, partly by the shape and mobility of our arms, hands, and fingers, from whose position in feeling objects the understanding derives its data for constructing bodies in space, partly by muscular power, which enables it to know the weight, solidity, toughness, or brittleness of bodies, all this with the least possible liability to error. These data, nevertheless, do not by any means yet give perception, which is always the work of the understanding. The sensation I have in pressing against a table with my hand contains no representation of a firm cohesion of parts in that object, nor indeed anything at all like it. It is only when my understanding passes from that sensation to its cause that the intellect constructs for itself a body having the properties of solidity, impenetrability, and hardness. If in the dark I put my hand upon a flat surface, or lay hold of a ball of about 3 inches in diameter, the same parts of my hand feel the pressure in both cases. It is only by the different position which my hand takes that, in the one or in the other case, my understanding constructs the shape of the body whose contact is the cause of the sensation, for which it receives confirmation from the changes of position which I make. The sensations in the hand of a man born blind, on feeling an object of cubic shape, are quite uniform and the same on all sides and in every direction. The edges, it is true, press upon a smaller portion of his hand. Still nothing at all like a cube is contained in these sensations. His understanding, however, draws the immediate and intuitive conclusion from the resistance felt, that this resistance must have a cause, which then presents itself through that conclusion as a hard body, and through the movements of his arms in feeling the object, while the hand sensation remains unaltered. He constructs the cubic shape in space, which is known to him a priori. If the representation of a cause and of space, together with their laws, had not already existed within him, the image of a cube could never have proceeded from those successive sensations in his hand. If a rope be drawn through his hand, he will construct, as the cause of the friction he feels and of its duration, a long cylindrical body moving uniformly in the same direction in that particular position of his hand. But the representation of movement, i.e. of change of place in space by means of time, never could arise for him out of the mere sensation in his hand. For that sensation can neither contain, nor can it ever by itself alone produce, any such thing. It is his intellect which must, on the contrary, contain within itself before all experience the intuitions of space, time, and, together with them, that of the possibility of movement, and it must also contain the representation of causality, in order to pass from sensation, which alone is given by experience, to a cause of that sensation, and to construct that cause as a body having this or that shape, moving in this or that direction. For how great is the difference between a mere sensation in my hand and the representations of causality, materiality, and mobility in space by means of time. The sensation in my hand, even if its position and its points of contact are altered, is a thing far too uniform and far too poor in data to enable me to construct out of it the representation of space, with its 3 dimensions, and of the influences of bodies one upon another, together with the properties of expansion, impenetrability, cohesion, shape, hardness, softness, rest, and motion, the basis, in short, of the objective world. This is, on the contrary, only possible by the intellect containing within itself, anterior to all experience, space as the form of perception, time as the form of change, and the law of causality as the regulator of the passing in and out of changes. Now it is precisely the pre-existence before all experience of all these forms which constitutes the intellect. Physiologically, it is a function of the brain, which the brain no more learns by experience than the stomach to digest, or the liver to secrete bile. Besides, no other explanation can be given of the fact that many who were born blind acquire a sufficiently complete knowledge of the relations of space to enable them to replace their want of eyesight by it to a considerable degree, and to perform astonishing feats. 100 years ago, Saunderson, for instance, who was blind from his birth, lectured on optics, mathematics, and astronomy at Cambridge. This, too, is the only way to explain the exactly opposite case of Eva Lauk, who was born without arms or legs, yet acquired an accurate perception of the outer world by means of sight alone as rapidly as other children. All this, therefore, proves that time, space, and causality are not conveyed into us by touch or by sight, or indeed at all from outside, but that they have an internal, consequently not empirical, but intellectual origin. From this again follows that the perception of the bodily world is an essentially intellectual process, a work of the understanding, to which sensation merely gives the opportunity and the data for application in individual cases.